Primary mechanisms are social forces that affect inequalities in education that directly affect students' capacity to learn. So in other words, primary mechanisms are outside of a school's and a teacher's control. Part of the primary mechanisms that we need to look at in regards to school readiness involves the whole nature-nurture debate. How much of the lack of school preparedness of lower income students is due to nature or biology, and how much of it is due to nurture or socialization. No, I am not suggesting for even one moment that a person of a lower income is not as genetically intelligent as somebody from a higher income. Not at all, no way. However, basic individual ability is a primary mechanism no matter what family you come from. And the fact is, there are measured differences in people's intelligence. Some people are naturally more intelligent in different ways than other people. Some seem to have a natural aptitude for science or math or writing, maybe for carpentry work, for mechanics, for music. Some people seem to have the basic ability to learn easier and quicker more than others, so that incorporating new material is just easier for them, or remembering new information, or applying new information. It seems to take them less effort. And in academic settings, if a student has more natural academic ability, they will naturally achieve more. With that, if their natural academic ability is specifically nurtured more in the home, they will achieve more. So this leads to the question, is the natural ability something they were born with? Does it have a genetic basis, or is it something that emerges because their parents and their home environment encouraged and supported it? This is the nature-nurture debate, and there's no definitive answer here. But considerable research exists supporting the argument that children who are encouraged to learn, who are regularly provided opportunities for learning, which will thus socialize and condition them to learn how to be inquisitive and thus be more likely to do both, will then spend more time learning and be more motivated to do so. So even if intelligence is dependent somewhat on an inherited genetic component, if that inherited component is not nurtured and encouraged and supported, it will not develop anywhere near to the level where it could. It is the nurturing, the encouragement, the support, the opportunity, the overall environment, the underlying expectation of learning and expectation of learning how to learn that's key. So individual ability is certainly a primary mechanism when it comes to learning, but combined with this is the need to nurture that. And research has demonstrated for a very long period of time that children from lower income homes are much less likely to have academic ability and intellectual ability nurtured while toddlers and in the early elementary years as much as children from higher income homes. Overall, a main reason why students from less advantaged families have more difficulty at school is because of a lack of school readiness. I've mentioned this several times in this course, so I want to be very, very specific about what I'm talking about. School readiness refers to a child's developmental stage at which they are able to participate in and benefit from early learning experiences. And again, it is a fact, statistically speaking, lower income students are more likely to lack this, which might be viewed as a politically incorrect statement by some to just generalize all low-income students as being the same, or as an extension of that to imply that all lower-income parents don't make the same effort to prepare their kids for school in the same manner as middle or upper-class parents. This isn't a politically incorrect opinion, it's a fact demonstrated by the vast majority of research regarding school readiness in various ways. Statistically speaking, children from lower income homes lack the knowledge, skills, and even the attitudes necessary for success in school and for learning later in life. In other words, when a student begins school and they're already not meeting learning expectations, right from the first day, without direct, consistent intervention, they will likely stay behind, and that gap in achievement will widen each year. Absolutely, the children will learn and continue to progress through each grade, but it's less likely they will ever completely catch up. Why? Whole bunch of reasons. Lower income parents are usually not as familiar with how to effectively advocate for their children in the education system, and they're not as likely to do so. They're not as likely to be able to put the effort and the time and have the wherewithal to prepare kids for school in the same way. This can refer to letter recognition, name recognition. By name recognition, I mean seeing your printed name. Familiarity with sight words and books to stimulate an early interest in reading. It can refer to social skills or regular encouragement to develop a proper pencil grip through encouragement to color and draw and scribble, so that a child doesn't come to school on the very first day of junior kindergarten already behind academically speaking. This lack of school readiness might also refer to the most basic things like nutrition, support at home for schoolwork, having as much parental supervision in the home because parents are working more. When it comes to school readiness, the most glaringly obvious disparities usually involve language, referring to both written and spoken language. When a student is speaking, the size of their vocabulary, grammatical structure and sentence structure, conversational skills, language abilities, and simple literacy overall are a great big flashing sign of differential preparedness for school. Because all longitudinal studies point to a connection between delays in the early years regarding general literacy and lower achievement in the later years regarding literacy. In other words, when a student has difficulties regarding literacy in the early years of school, they'll likely have problems later on as well, unless there is effective, consistent intervention. And research indicates that students from lower income homes are less likely to have exposure to reading in the home, less likely to have exposure to more complex verbal structures, and they're less likely to have exposure to other cultural opportunities. You know, remember Annette Leroux in her research, she talked about how styles of parenting vary according to social class. And her research backs this up. So being unprepared to be educated right from the first day of school puts a student at a disadvantage right from the first day of school, because lack of school readiness is directly correlated to poor educational attainment. For example, in Manitoba, 12% of students whose families collected social assistance passed a standardized writing test, compared to 89% of students whose families did not collect social assistance. And remember that this will have a generational effect. Those kids who lack school readiness, who are behind right from the very first day of school in junior kindergarten, will grow up and have their own families. So this advantage really persists over the life course, so that as an extension of this, you'll then be able to provide your own children the same kind of educational advantage and resources, creating a generational effect. So then, educational advantage becomes an inherited advantage, something to be passed down through each generation. Just as you might inherit money from your parents, or property, or a set of dishes, or jewelry, you also inherit an educational advantage, or you don't. Obviously, a parent can't just actually give their child their bachelor's degree or master's degree, so how does this advantage actually occur? Very simply, through indirect means. So that those families who are more affluent or who have more financial resources, who are of higher socioeconomic status, and thus are able to intervene more directly in their children's education to systematically improve their kids' life chances, do so. And this takes place across generations. I don't think this is a surprise to anybody, but maybe stating it this way is stating that educational advantage is in large part inherited. Because this makes it very clear then that the education system is not necessarily the great equalizer that it is commonly perceived to be. Even if you personally do not believe that the education system is deliberately and systematically reproducing inequality and reinforcing inequality as Marxists would have us believe, it's very difficult to argue that it's this great equalizing force where everybody begins the race at the same starting line and is provided a level and equal playing field. So there is interaction between socioeconomic status and educational achievement because social and economic privilege increases the chances of gaining higher levels of education. The socioeconomic status of a student's family has been shown to impact on his or her overall educational attainment. Now, what I'm saying here has been acknowledged for decades. Whether a person personally believes that a student's status is the prime contributing factor regarding their academic achievement, or just one factor among others, everybody believes that it is at least a factor. But when this was first determined to be true, believe it or not, it was considered absolutely shocking, really groundbreaking. It was in 1966 that the Coleman Report was published, but it's still important for a very good reason. And it's because prior to this report, it was widely believed that the main cause of inequality in educational outcomes was because of vast inequalities that existed within schools. So lower grades, lower test scores, lower dropout rate with lower income students. Everybody said it's because of the schools. It's because of the schools. As we equalize the schools, then we're not going to have a problem. Nobody disputed this. So because of that, the focus was differences in government funding between different schools and school districts, which would affect budgets and teacher salaries and class sizes and library funds and other resources and all of that. It was widely believed that any variation in student achievement stemmed largely from these inequalities in school quality and resources. And so it was thought, if that's what you think, it would make sense that if funding for education was made more equitable, more similar between schools, no matter what neighborhood a school was in, then achievement gaps would deteriorate and the achievement between students of a lower and higher status would even out. So that would make sense, right? If you've determined that's what the problem is, well, then we'll just make schools as similar as possible. So when James Coleman and his colleagues were commissioned to write a report on educational inequality in the United States, this was a huge deal because their conclusions were completely unexpected. The first of their kind, really throwing a wrench in this popular belief, because while the Coleman Report certainly found that yes, of course, resource inequality at school will have an impact on student outcomes, student achievement was much better predicted by a student's own family background. So in other words, it's a student's socioeconomic status as indicated by their parents. That's the key thing. So take a look at the parents' own education, the parents' job status, the parents' income, all of that. In other words, the report concluded that family environment was a better predictor of student achievement than the school environment. That family-based preparation for school was a much stronger indicator of student achievement. So in schools with a large percentage of lower income students who were not demonstrating good economic achievement, they brought the achievement gap with them into the school. They brought the inequality with them into the classroom. So for the most part, schools were not causing achievement gaps. And we have other evidence as well. Maybe you've heard of seasonal learning, also called summer learning loss or the summer setback. There is a lot of literature available based on this one concept, no matter what you call it. Academics have approached this in kind of a roundabout but common sense way. Let's say that schools did in fact have the greatest impact on student learning than their family. Then that would mean that during the school year, when students are attending school, these achievement gaps would grow bigger and bigger while they're in school. And then during the summer months, the growth in these gaps would freeze. They would stop. That's not what happens. Instead, gaps in educational achievement between students of higher and lower status grow bigger during the summer, and they lessen during the school year because of the effect of being in school, suggesting that schools don't disadvantage lower income students, but instead help to kind of mitigate the effect of their home and neighborhood during the school year. And this is exactly what does happen across the board. The body of research available regarding seasonal learning is almost completely 100% unanimous in its conclusion that going to school during the fall and winter months tends to reduce learning gaps along economic lines, but these gaps widen in the summer when students are not in school. So that is that literacy and numeracy skills of many disadvantaged youth suffer a summer setback between June and September. The learning that they had the previous year tends to erode to a certain degree. In contrast, skills for middle and upper status students tend to remain steady and sometimes even rise during the summer months as their parents are able to provide them continuing learning opportunities when school is not in session. It's common for these students to gain more skills and knowledge during the summer months because their parents are more likely to provide them various opportunities for activities or for actual learning. These might be things that we all automatically think about, like participation in sports, baseball, soccer, swimming, biking, etc. Keep in mind that participation in these various activities also necessarily includes improving socialization skills and social relationships with others, making social connections, at an older age, networking, improving your vocabulary and conversational skills. And opportunities to learn might also be things that are less structured. Just what a kid has available at home on a daily basis, up-to-date computers in the home, readily available books or magazine subscriptions, more opportunity for developing language and dialogue. Having parents available more to take you to the beach, go on outings, not sitting in an urban area with no green space with a high density of population. So these findings regarding summer learning loss and the impact this has on lower income students compared to middle or higher income students have been repeated over and over, leading the majority of researchers to conclude that although certainly the education system as a whole and schools individually are not completely equal places, that they do in fact function as equalizers, at least in terms of measured learning. So they might not be the great equalizer, but they help. So that differences between different status groups, they conclude, stem more from outside forces which schools have to contend with, not forces from within the education system. And just as a side note, students whose family don't speak English as a first language tend to have a particularly difficult time with seasonal learning. Understandably, parents often want to do what they can to encourage their kids to maintain their first language, whatever it may be, because it's an important part of their culture. So they often speak only their first language at home. But for these students to then essentially take a 2-month break from learning or practicing English, this can and does cause huge problems for them. I mean, pause for a second And imagine that you're going to finish your current degree in a different language, let's say Vietnamese. So you're trying really hard to learn the language. But then Christmas break rolls around and you go home for 3 weeks and barely speak any Vietnamese at all. Come January, you're going to be kicking yourself because it's going to be much more difficult for you. And keep in mind that even though you're going to finish your degree in a different language, you're still expected to achieve at the same level as the rest of the students around you for whom Vietnamese is their first language. Now, as an adult, we can immediately see how totally counterproductive that would be. But now imagine what it's like for a child who does not yet have your level of maturity. Closely linked to socioeconomic status are neighborhood characteristics. Every family lives where they can afford to live. Pretty straightforward. Neighborhoods that are mainly lower income can negatively impact children's academic achievement. Which might sound kind of odd. How can your neighborhood affect you academically? This has been an area of study for sociologists as well as numerous other academics for years. And certain trends have emerged as a result of research across numerous disciplines. Children living in lower income neighborhoods with a high concentration of poverty are more likely to have parents that are unemployed or underemployed. They are more likely to attend lower quality schools with staff that are minimally educated compared to other schools, staff that are more likely to be discouraged and forced to make do with the lack of resources. These children are more likely to find themselves with a constrained social network that doesn't give them access to contacts who reinforce the value of education. So meaning they are in this neighborhood all the time without any kind of different perspective. And it may sound hokey, but there's a lack of positive role models. Now, most of these conclusions come from research conducted in the United States, but Canada does have the same issues in larger urban areas. Now, I'm well aware that it sounds like I am assuming or stereotyping lower income families and their kids by assuming they're all going to have difficulties in school that higher status students do not. It sounds like I'm assuming and stereotyping lower status neighborhoods to be all the same with the same social problems. And that's not my intention. But the fact is that lower income neighborhoods in urban areas do in fact have a larger amount of economic disorganization and social disorganization. It's not guaranteed, but it's much more likely. Talking specifically about these schools, these are schools located in concentrated poverty neighborhoods in large urban areas, meaning that poverty is simply more concentrated. There's more of it in a smaller area, more concentrated on a larger scale than is true of other lower status neighborhoods or other neighborhoods in general. Especially in larger cities, families and students tend to be particularly isolated within a distinctive urban subculture. And because of that, schools tend to face particularly serious problems related to the difficult living conditions that characterize these neighborhoods. As I said, students in these neighborhoods live in more restricted environments than do students elsewhere in various ways. More restricted economically, socially, academically, regarding opportunities or a lack of them of every kind. And the thing is, it's not just you. Everybody around you are dealing with the same issues as well. And then their teachers struggle daily to overcome these problems and more difficult problems than do teachers in higher status, higher income schools, which commonly results in a very high percentage of low achievers. So this is the condition of poverty. It's not just the lack of money. Of course, living in poverty means you have a lack of money, but it's the persistent disadvantage that goes along with the lack of money. It's everything that that lack of economic security provides. It's the overall condition of poverty, which, as I said, results in a much higher concentration of low achievers. And a low achiever is simply somebody who consistently performs poorly in school. It has nothing to do with an illness or a temporary problem at home, adjusting to a divorce, adjusting to a new school, having difficulties with peers one year. No, this usually begins in the first year of kindergarten and continues throughout. So they start a little bit behind, and every year while they do progress, they never really catch up to where they should be for their grade level. So every year they're a little bit more behind and a little bit more behind. Now, it's thought that one possible contributing factor to this, especially for lower income students in these neighborhoods with a high concentration of poverty, is something called a chronic activation level. So chronic means ongoing, and a chronic activation level basically means for these students in these neighborhoods, a certain level of noise, a certain level of activity is the norm for them. They learn to require continuous stimulus change, so that when they're in a classroom that, is pretty quiet, and they're expected to be quiet and sit still and not move around, that they're disadvantaged because the classroom environment and expected classroom behavior goes completely against what is their normal state of being outside of the school. Neighborhoods with a high concentration of poverty in urban areas tend to be very unsettled. A lot of traffic, a lot of foot traffic, people moving around a lot because of financial problems, people changing jobs more often, little or no green space. There's always something going on, and that becomes the norm. Just like for you, if you can't sleep or concentrate when there's the noise and stuff going on, for these students, they can't sleep or concentrate when it's too quiet, because that's not their daily reality outside of school. And it's thought that this overstimulation in the home and neighborhood environment directly interferes with learning by making students unusually distractible and inattentive, which of course is going to be a huge disadvantage in the education system, where everybody's supposed to be quiet and orderly. So it's almost in a way like these students are being penalized then for their social status. So they're being punished for not fitting into a settled, traditional school environment because their home life, their life outside of school doesn't fit with that. They have more difficulty learning, focusing, and concentrating because the school environment is so different from what they're used to. They have more behavioral problems and social problems at school when, in a way, these things are literally not their fault because they have no control over the circumstances of their home environment. So overall, a school's failure to take children's activity level into account may be an example of blaming or victimizing the child for the institution's failure to make appropriate adaptations for them.